Every morning for 3 years, a tanker truck backed down Maren Gould's gravel drive before the sun cleared the ridge, and every morning she stood at the fence line and watched it dump. Nobody asked her what she was doing with it. Nobody really looked. What she was building behind that barn would take a decade to become undeniable, and when it did, the people who had never asked were the first to want an explanation. If you are watching this from a farm, a small town, or a piece of land someone told you was not worth the trouble, this story is for you. Subscribe to DK Farm Stories and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. These stories are worth traveling. Yell County sits in the Arkansas River Valley, pressed between the Ouachita Mountains to the south and the Boston Mountains pushing down from the Ozark Plateau in the north. It is cattle country in the way that hill country usually is, not because the land is generous, but because cattle are forgiving. The soil runs thin over sandstone and chert in the uplands. The bottomland near the river is richer, but floods take it without warning. The county seat of Dardanelle sits on a bluff above the Arkansas River, looking out over bottom ground that has been in row crops and cow pasture for going on 200 years. The old Yell County Fairgrounds still stands at the edge of town, though the livestock exhibitions it once ran have mostly given way to smaller events. The community is quieter than it was a generation ago, smaller in population, more spread out. The farms that remain tend to be held by people who did not leave when leaving was easy. That is a different kind of farmer from one who chose it freely. It means something specific about how they hold on to a problem. Dardanelle was also, in the years Maren was building her operation, home to a feed store and a county extension office, and a circle of neighbors who knew each other well enough to form opinions quickly. Small places develop a kind of informal audit on what is worth trying and what is not. The audit is not always right. It is always present. Maren Gould was 47 when her husband Darrell died of a stroke in the cab of his tractor. She had not planned to run the place alone. The 210 acres they kept in pasture and hay ground was meant to be his project. She had run the bookkeeping, managed the household, driven equipment when he needed a second body. She knew the land. She did not particularly want to be responsible for it in the way that sole ownership demands. Her nearest neighbor, a retired county extension man named Clifton Prade, told her plainly at the funeral that she ought to sell the cow herd and lease the pasture ground out. He was not being unkind. He meant it practically, the way someone who has watched 100 farm operations fold over 30 years of county work learns to speak. "You are already running hard," he told her. "This does not have to be your problem." Her daughter Shelby, 22 and working a logistics job in Fort Smith, said roughly the same thing on the phone that night. "Mama, nobody is going to think less of you." Maren did not sell. She did not explain herself either. She kept the herd at 41 cows, hired a part-time hand named Declan Pruitt, who was 16 and needed summer work, and started figuring out what Darrell had known that she did not yet know. Declan was the younger brother of a woman who cut Maren's hair in Dardanelle. He had grown up around animals and was not squeamish about work, but he had no formal training and no strong opinions about how things ought to be done, which suited Maren well enough in that first year. She was not looking for someone who already knew the right way. She was not sure she did either. She kept moving because stopping felt like a different kind of decision, and she was not ready to make it. The brewery came into it by accident. There was a craft brewing operation 40 minutes east, in a river town that had been trying to reinvent itself for the better part of 20 years. The owner, a man named Gus Hetler, had been hauling spent grain to a composting outfit in Conway, but the arrangement fell through in the second summer after Darrell died. The composting operation had taken on a municipal contract and no longer had capacity. Hetler called a feed store. The feed store called a farmer they knew. The farmer was already committed elsewhere, and somehow the chain of calls reached Maren. She said yes, because the hauling was free, and she did not know yet what she was saying yes to. The first delivery came on a Tuesday. The driver backed the tanker in, opened the valve, and approximately 8,000 pounds of wet spent grain slid out behind the south barn in a dark, steaming heap. It smelled like warm bread, with something faintly sour underneath. The July heat pulled the smell in all directions. Declan stood next to her looking at it. He asked what they were doing with it. Maren had no answer for him yet. She had heard, somewhere she could not precisely place, that Brewer's grain was used as cattle feed in some operations. She opened the back gate and let the herd into the pasture behind the barn. The cattle found the pile within an hour. They ate from the edges where the material had cooled and spread thin, pulling mouthfuls of the wet barley and wheat mash. They went back the following morning, and the day after, working the edges with the deliberate patience of animals that have decided something is worth returning to. She called Hetler and told him to keep the trucks coming. What she did not understand yet, and would not fully understand for another 2 years, was what was happening inside that pile. Spent brewery grain is what remains after the mash is cooked, and the liquid is drawn off for fermentation. It contains roughly 25 to 30% crude protein on a dry matter basis, high in rumen-degradable protein and digestible fiber, specifically the fibrous hulls and residual starch left in the grain after the sugars have been extracted for brewing. It is wet, often 60 to 70% moisture by weight, which makes it heavy and expensive to haul any distance, but also makes it biologically active the moment it leaves the tank. When it accumulates in warm weather, at that moisture level, it does not simply wait, it ferments. The microbial population already present in the grain, mainly lactic acid bacteria, takes over the pile from the outside moving inward. Within 48 to 72 hours of a fresh delivery, the interior of the pile drops in pH as lactic and acetic acids accumulate. The temperature in the core of a large pile rises enough to destroy common pathogens, while preserving the microbial activity useful to rumen function in cattle. This is essentially the same biology as silage fermentation. The same chemistry that farmers depend on when they pack corn or sorghum into bunkers and seal it under plastic to preserve feed value across a long winter. An open pile does not seal, so it does not preserve with the same efficiency over time. But in the first 10 days after a fresh delivery, the outer portion of the pile is in active, productive fermentation. The high protein content is the first piece of why it works. Cattle on summer fescue grass, which is what Maren ran on most of her pasture, are getting adequate energy from the forage, but often fall short on rumen-degradable protein during peak summer heat, when fescue quality drops and sometimes becomes toxic through endophyte infection. The brewery grain fills that gap without a purchased supplement. The second piece is the volatile fatty acids produced during fermentation, which contribute directly to palatability. Cattle seek out the fresh material, return to it at predictable times of day, and manage their own intake with more precision than anyone standing at the fence would give them credit for. They do not gorge. They work the pile the way they work good pasture, selectively and in rotation, and then move off. Maren did not know any of this vocabulary. What she knew was that her cows were gaining condition in August, which was not what August usually looked like in that place. Clifton Prade stopped by in September of that first year, walked the south pasture, and said nothing specific. He looked at the cattle. He looked at the pile. He told her the place looked reasonable, which was his version of a compliment, and left without asking about the grain. The first full year went well. Declan weighed calves at weaning, and the numbers were up from what they had been in Daryl's last 2 years. Maren paid down a portion of the operating note she had been carrying since his death. She said nothing about why to anyone, partly because she was not entirely sure she understood why, and partly because nobody asked. The trouble came in the second spring. Hitler called in March. He had taken on a contract customer, a regional grocery chain testing a private label beer line, and production was going up by 30%. The deliveries would increase. Was she set up for that? She said yes, because the arithmetic looked right. More grain, more supplementation, lower per-head feed costs. What she had not thought through was drainage. The new volume pushed the pile past the gravel pad behind the south barn and onto the slope below it. The concentrated liquid fraction from the fermenting grain, rich in nitrogen compounds and organic acids, drained toward the low end of her best bottomland pasture. By May, that corner was a mat of compacted, nitrogen-burned ground. The fescue was gone in an irregular oval roughly 50 feet across. The cattle avoided it. The smell reached the road on warm afternoons. Clifton Prade drove past one Saturday, slowed his truck, and kept going. Shelby called from Fort Smith the following week. A neighbor had mentioned something. Was everything okay out there? Marin told her it was a work in progress. She spent 2 weekends in June going through every piece of material she could find on spent grain management and drainage. She built a second containment pad further from the slope, using crushed rock from a quarry near Ola. She redirected the runoff with a shallow berm that she and Declan constructed with a rented skid steer over 3 long evenings. She sent soil samples from the damaged area to a lab in Russellville and learned that the nitrogen loading had been severe but not irreversible. Given one full growing season and a light overseeding in fall, the fescue stand should recover. It did. Over the following 18 months, the burned area came back. What grew back in that patch was thicker than what had been there before. The nitrogen pulse that had destroyed the original stand had also broken down the dense thatch layer and reset the soil biology underneath. The fescue that returned was darker and denser, and the cattle grazed it earlier in spring and held on it later into fall than the surrounding ground. She had not intended that. It arrived as a consequence of a mistake she had corrected. By the 4th year, Marin was running 63 cows, up from 41 at Daryl's death. She had added a stocker operation, buying lightweight calves in October, carrying them through winter on the grain supplementation, and selling them in spring when her wintering costs were low. Feed bills for the winter months had become nearly negligible. Declan, now 20 and working full-time, told her he had looked up what they were doing, and there was a formal name for it, and a documented body of research. She told him she was glad to hear it. The turning point came through a livestock buyer named Tate Mosser, who worked a circuit through the Arkansas River Valley, sourcing backgrounded cattle for a feedlot operation based in Oklahoma. Mosser had been coming through Yell County for years. He had a practiced eye and was not given to enthusiasm. He walked Marin's pastures in October, looked at the stocker calves for a long time, and asked her what she was running for winter supplement. She told him everything she could name about it. Brewery grain, fermented in open piles, managed for drainage, left for the cattle to work on their own terms. Mosser was quiet for a moment. He asked how long. She told him 4 years. He looked at the cattle again. He walked along the fence line and stopped at the corner where the calves were bunched in the shade, looking them over one at a time with the unhurried attention of someone who has done this long enough to stop talking while he thinks. Then he walked back and wrote her a check for the full lot at a price above what 2 other buyers had offered that week. When she asked why the difference, he said the flesh cover was consistent in a way he did not often see in backgrounded calves that had come through an Arkansas winter. They looked like they had eaten well without being pushed. Calves that are pushed show it in the way they carry their weight. These did not. That was harder to produce than most people understood, and he priced it accordingly. Marin deposited the check on Thursday. She called Shelby that night and told her the calves had sold well. Shelby said that was good to hear. She did not ask questions. Clifton prayed moved to Batesville the following spring to be near his daughter. He stopped by once before he left. They walked the back pasture in the early morning, and when they came around the south barn and the grain pile came into view, he stopped and looked at it for a while without speaking. He said it looked like she had figured something out. She told him it had taken longer than she would have liked. He nodded and drove away, and she did not see him again. The practice stayed on her farm. No one from the county extension office ever called. No one from the university wrote it up. Tate Mosser came back the following 2 autumns and bought the stocker calves again at similar prices, and brought a colleague once who asked careful questions and then drove off without following up. Nobody in the valley began doing what Marin was doing. She was not bothered by that. She had not set out to demonstrate anything to anybody. The knowledge existed, documented in agricultural literature, that any county library could have surfaced. The method was not obscure. It was simply outside the habit of the place, and habits in Yell County did not move quickly. Marin understood this about the county, because it was also true of her. She had come to the grain by accident, and stayed with it out of stubbornness, and then out of evidence. She did not expect anyone else to follow the same path. She expected them to find their own, if they were going to find one at all. The south barn still stands. Behind it, the pad of crushed rock has been extended twice over the years. The pile is there most of the year, steam lifting off the top on cold mornings, cattle working the edges in the low light. The bottom land that burned and came back is the best fescue on the property now. The berm holds the drainage where it belongs. The tanker comes twice a week from Clarksville. Nobody driving past on the county road stops to ask what the pile is. It does not announce itself.